Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to foster, stimulate, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, we host over 150 free public programs, including exhibitions, lectures, readings, and musical performances. To find out more about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org, or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. For today's event, celebrating suffrage, we're joined by Mary Murray, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at Munson-Williams Proctor Arts Institute, who will moderate a showcase of 3 exceptional artists and curators linking contemporary issues to 19th century practices. This program is presented in partnership with Munson-Williams Proctor Arts Institute. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, let me pass the baton on to Mary. Please enjoy the program.
On behalf of Munson-Williams Proctor Arts Institute, I would like to thank the National Arts Club and Nadine and Ben for inviting us to participate in this program. And it's a real pleasure and an honor. And I must acknowledge David Zyla, who is on the Board of Governors of the Arts Club, who contacted Barbara Kane, my colleague, who is the Public Programs Coordinator at Munson-Williams Proctor. And it was David who had the original idea that we should collaborate. Many thanks to Barbara for orchestrating things on our side. I am indebted to our speakers today for their enthusiastic response and for their time and effort. May I have the first slide, please? At Munson-Williams, I would like to thank Miranda Hofelt, who is the Curator of 19th century American art, and with whom I collaborated on this exhibition, Celebrating Suffrage, Women Artists from the Collection. This project is the impetus for our program this evening. The show includes works of art dating from 1802 to 2019, and it demonstrates how women have created space for themselves as artists and designers, both amateurs and professionals, within a larger cultural context that was at best indifferent and at worst blocked their efforts. Miranda and I were struck time and again by the connections that can be found between the 19th century concerns, use of materials that continued into the 20th and 21st centuries. Next slide, please. And it's that conversation between the decades over the centuries that is the real subject of our presentation tonight. We've invited 3 wonderful speakers to address the inspiration they have derived from 19th century writers, artists, and practices. And let me begin introductions by having the next slide, please. Sabrina Gschwandtner is joining us from Los Angeles. She has exhibited her work from London to New York, from Los Angeles to Bucharest. Her work is included in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and very recently has been acquired by the LA County Museum. So congratulations to Sabrina on that acquisition. For about 10 years, Sabrina created this kind of quilt square from discarded educational films from the Fashion Institute of Technology. So this afternoon, we will be hearing Sabrina talk about the intersection of quilting and textiles and feminism. Next slide, please. Lesley Dill has enjoyed a distinguished career with numerous solo shows, with monographic publications, and very important awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. Next year, the Figge Museum in Davenport, Iowa, will present an exhibition about Lesley's work, recent material, and it's my great delight to say that Munson-Williams Proctor will be one of the venues on that tour. Lesley creates very beautiful poetic works that unite the tangible with the ineffable, and she uses delicate materials, paper and thread, and unites them with photography and printmaking, performance, and most significantly with words, notably with the poetry of Emily Dickinson. And this evening we will also see her introducing voices of other 19th century women. Next slide, please. And our first speaker this evening will be Dr. Linda S. Ferber. Linda is Museum Director Emerita from the New York Historical Society and was a longtime Andrew Mellon Curator of American Art and the Chief Curator at the Brooklyn Museum. And as an independent curator, Linda has organized the exhibition for the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., titled American Pre-Raphaelites, Radical Realists. And she included this work by Fidelia Bridges from our museum. Let me remind you, please put in your questions if you have them. I hope we'll have some time for comments and questions after our speakers. Thank you all again for joining, and many thanks to our speakers. Now I pass the program to Linda.
Thrilled to be here this evening and participating in this terrific program. And I'm speaking about, as Mary said, I'm speaking about Fidelia Bridges. And I'd like the first slide, please. Thank you. Just let me make this a little bigger on my screen. On the left, you see a carte de visite photograph of Fidelia Bridges, probably taken about 1864, when she was a young woman in her early 20s. It's a fascinating document. Fidelia came to the studio wearing a snappy adaptation of a zouave uniform, dressed for a sketching expedition to draw and perhaps paint out of doors, as the landscape backdrop behind her indicates. She clearly intended her carefully posed image as a manifesto of a professional woman, a visual calling card, as carte de visites were. She's not seated inside, but standing outdoors. No, go back, please. Thank you. Looking at us, but her body is turned as if to walk out of the picture with the tools of her trade. A white folding umbrella and paint box supported by a carrying strap over her shoulder. She was already a pro by 1864, as you see from this study of ferns. She had had early drawing lessons as a girl in Salem, Massachusetts, in the context of the education of a genteel young woman. She was the daughter of a prosperous ship captain in the China trade, but her skills became a means of earning a living after both parents died, one after the other, in 1849 and 1850. Fidelia and her sisters moved to Brooklyn, where they had family connections. She was a painter in oil and later a watercolor specialist. This early study measures only 10 by 12 inches, and it's characteristic of her early work in oil. It's a classic American oil study from nature. Think Asher B. Durand, think William T. Richards, and it's small enough certainly to have been painted out of doors. Could I have the next slide, please? Next, please. Oh, thank you. Okay. This is one of my favorites. Laura Brown in a wing chair. This takes us to Brooklyn, and the Brown family were apparently cousins of theirs. And the sisters reopened a school that they had tried to run in Salem with poor results. And Fidelia also continued her art studies in Brooklyn and neighboring New York City. These were separate cities, of course, with very separate and very rich art lives, each of them. A wonderful visual catalog of an upstairs chamber, either in the Brown residence or her own apartment with her sister. You can see the roofs outside, so you know that they're sort of almost in the garret. A daughter of the Brown family, Laura, a young girl, peruses an album of sketches, paintings, books, and portfolios, present a life dedicated to culture and the arts. While fine old furnishings, the wing chair, the rug, and the wonderful sort of desk against the wall, present a life, suggest the richer circumstances of her early life in Salem. And the fabulous trailing ivy that brings nature indoors. And I want you to note the small painting in the arched frame over the wing chair, which is so similar to the little painting of the study of ferns that we see on the right. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll try to stay steady. Okay. Somebody tell me if this is a good position to take, and I'll maintain it. This is, again, Milkweeds, a tour de force. She had further instructions from William T. Richards. This is a work of 1876, who was an important mentor and lifetime friend from 1860 when they actually met. Here we have robust weeds flourishing in the middle of a cultivated wheat field. And it's a composition and a narrative similar to landscape parables painted by Richards during the Civil War a decade earlier. The invasion of the cultivated by the wild was a symbol then, a botanical symbol of secession and disorder. Although the tall milkweed still dominates the stage in this all foreground composition, the mood has lightened to one of decorative brilliance. Can I have the next, please? Next slide, please. Thank you. These arrangements of wildflowers, weeds, and birds silhouetted against the sky with only a hint of a terrain behind them became Bridges' silhouette compositions, mostly executed in watercolors, a very popular medium at the time, but also occasionally in oil, and particularly as cards. You see here, these are from the 12-month series. They are chromolithographs, published, I think, in 1885, 86, possibly earlier, and they were made from watercolors by Fidelia, chromolithographed by the Prang and Company in Boston. And I'm a nut for chromolithographs. I don't know if you're familiar with them. It was an extraordinarily expensive and labor-intensive method of creating richly colored images like these mechanically. It was essentially a mass media. And it did away with the earlier customs of hand coloring prints. And it turned the production of these on all scales, sometimes after paintings like these, sometimes simply pure designs. They were for all seasons, they were for all occasions, and they represent the infancy of the greeting card industry today. Think Hallmark. And they actually have a fantastic collection of Fidelia Bridges chromolithographs. Fidelia was also in demand as an illustrator. And she worked for Prang, in fact, as a staff designer from 1881 until 1899. So she was a professional woman. Have I disappeared? Can somebody get me back?
You're good, Linda. Keep going.
Oh, I am good? Okay, I can't see the screen, but I'll continue. What you should be seeing, I hope, is pink roses. Are you?
Yes.
Okay, good. This elegant watercolor is far from the cheerful busyness of Milkweeds. And although they are compatible in date, 1875, 1876, Pink Roses takes cues not only from the artist's fascination with the life of plants, but also from the influence of Asian design in the spare and empty space against which the rose bush is silhouetted. Fidelia would exhibit works like these, mainly watercolors, but also oils, at major venues for many decades. The Pennsylvania Academy, the National Academy of Design, the Brooklyn Art Association, the American Watercolor Society, and she was elected to membership in a number of these organizations. She died in 1923, having been born during the administration of Andrew Jackson and living to see the passage of the 18th Amendment. I don't know whether she voted. I hope that our program inspires you to draw parallels with the life experience of the other women who are celebrated here this evening. And I especially hope that Pink Roses evokes the poetry of Emily Dickinson, a contemporary. Although she died young and Fidelia lived long, they shared a New England background and subjects that were steeped in a love of gardens and a knowledge of botany that were widely shared taste among the cultured Americans in the 19th century. So Sabrina, you're on. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Linda.
You are welcome.
And thank you to everyone, to my fellow panelists, and to everyone here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to start by giving you a bit of background and information about my film quilts, which, as Mary mentioned, is a body of work that I made for about 10 years. You could start with the first slide, please. So I began this work in 2009, which is the year that the archivist at Anthology Film Archives, the screening venue and film archive in New York City, gave me a box of 16mm films that were deaccessioned from the Fashion Institute of Technology, otherwise known as FIT. So these were movies that were produced between the 1950s and the 1980s, and they were shown in classrooms at FIT until their deaccession. The box that I received from Anthology Film Archives contained educational documentaries about textiles, a very wide-ranging use of textiles. So textiles as art, as craft, as vocation, as military camouflage, as scientific metaphor, and textiles as political expression. Not only had the movie's subject matter, which was really mostly that of women creating textiles, been deemed unworthy of archiving or even really of use anymore at FIT, but some of the film had faded or discolored. You see the footage here that's red in this piece. That's an example of film fading from full color to this like mainly red color. So some of the film had this added like an additional layer of valuelessness to the work. So in an act that was meant to recast these undervalued histories of women's handcraft work and also to celebrate the medium of film, which has been really under threat since I started this body of work. You know, we all watch movies on Netflix now. We don't, especially during a pandemic, but even before then, if you were going to go to a movie theater, you're really more likely to see a movie projected on video than on film these days. And that had already started in 2009 when I was making this work. So I made my first 16mm film quilt in 2009 by cutting and sewing together lengths of film into a string quilt formation. And string quilts are often made with long, thin fabric scraps that are left over from other textile projects. And to me, linking movie film to textile seemed quite natural. I've always thought of movie film as a sort of textile because it takes 24 still frames on a piece of film to equal 1 second of motion. Film contains these sequential images that resemble patterned fabric. But there are also historical connections between filmmaking and sewing that are sort of little known. In the late 1800s, the Lumiere brothers adapted sewing machine mechanisms in order to advance film sprocket holes in their cinematograph, which was a dual camera and projector. And that's what they used to create one of the first motion pictures. And then in the early days of Hollywood, women were employed as film editors because of their experience sewing. They were thought to have like nimble fingers from doing sewing work that would translate well to putting strips of film together in a movie. There's still overlapping terminology between sewing and filmmaking. For example, we thread a projector with film. There's a notion that's called filmic suture, and that's the use of editing to draw audiences into a story. And I think of my film quilts as sort of a reconfiguring of this notion of filmic suture, or my sewing of film is the three-dimensional form of movie editing. And I think, to me, I think of how the thread that I use to sew together pieces of film is a material bond that reconnects these neglected handcraft histories to cinema. So the piece you're looking at here is titled Camouflage. So for this piece, I contrasted footage from an industrial textile manufacturing film. That's the dark footage that you see in this piece. And that film showed how fabric was made at the Bradford Dyeing Association in Rhode Island. And I contrasted it with footage from an instructional children's film about shadows from 1972. I purchased this film on eBay. And that's called Shadows Everywhere. And that's the pink footage. So we have the two films together. And I sewed them into a traditional sunshine and shadow American quilt motif using log cabin squares. The sunshine and shadow quilt pattern is the design that consists of contrasts in values of light and dark. And I designed this, there's so many different ways to make a sunshine and shadow design, but for this one, I wanted it to sort of look like there was a light source hovering above the piece, casting shadows that rippled down. Next slide, please. So the Bradford Dyeing Association was one of the oldest textile mills in the United States, and they provided camouflage to the US military for decades. They opened before the Civil War and closed in 2011 after years of labor rights abuses and environmental pollution. So the documentary about Bradford Dyeing never got into what was being made at the factory, and it falsely paints a portrait of happy workers. In the 1800s, women first went into the labor force because they weren't needed on farms anymore, so they could go into towns and become part of the first industrial labor force in America. And in the 1830s, it was progressive and liberating for women to do factory work. But as the days got longer and the conditions got worse, women organized and protested. Next slide, please. The second film shows two children making shadow puppets in front of a piece of cloth and looking at shadows created by the sun. Can you go back 2 slides to the first slide again, please? So in combining these two films, I wanted to represent the idea of camouflage in multiple ways. First, you have the children in the shadow film just exploring concealment and shadow in a very playful, very innocent way, and that contrasts with the more sinister, literal camouflage being made at the textile factory. And third, to me, there was another act of camouflage which happened in the documentary about the textile mill. In other words, here I wanted to acknowledge that whenever you shed light on something, you also leave other facts in shadow, which is what the filmmakers did. So in working with these same films, Deaccession from FIT, like the Bradford Dyeing Association film, which came from FIT, I've just developed all these different ways of working with the footage. Sometimes I will choose a scene or a subject or a narrative style from one of these documentaries to critique, as in Camouflage. And other times I chose a subject to honor, as in the next piece will show. So if you could go forward a couple slides to one more. Yes, so this is a piece called Elizabeth Keckley Diamond. For this piece, I created a center square and shifted it to form a diamond. That blue diamond contains footage from the 1988 film Hearts and Hands, which was directed by Pat Ferrero. Hearts and Hands is a documentary that chronicles the lives of ordinary women, as well as individuals like Elizabeth Keckley and Harriet Tubman. And it follows them through the great 19th century events of industrialization, abolition, the Civil War, westward movement, and suffrage. And the director of this film, Pat Ferrer herself, gave me this footage to use in my film quilts. And something she told me she made a real effort to do in the film is tell the story of 3 Black women who are known from their quilts, from their oral and written histories, and also from the photographic record. Next slide, please. So Elizabeth Keckley, who was one of the women featured in her film, is honored in this piece. And Elizabeth Keckley was born into slavery. She grew up helping her mother sew clothes. And through her work as a dressmaker in her early adult life, she bought her freedom and her son's freedom. She established a dressmaking service and business, and she became the personal dressmaker and close confidant and friend to Mary Todd Lincoln. She was known as the dressmaker in DC because her garments fit extraordinarily well. The blue footage is contrasted with this orange and yellow footage from another film that is a documentary on America's arts and crafts. And I use that footage in the background of that piece, sort of to highlight the diamond portrait of Elizabeth Keckley, and also to reestablish Keckley as in her place as a master crafts person in American history. And with that, I will turn this over to Lesley.
Sabrina, what extraordinarily beautiful and thoughtful work that you do. I am a fan. I have become a fan, and I'm going to Google you as soon as this is over. So thank you. It's such a pleasure to be invited to speak to everyone tonight. So I'm going to talk briefly about 5 amazing women in early America. One is Emily Dickinson, and it is the deep darkness and searing brightness of Dickinson's poetry that drew me to her work. Thank you, I forgot. I've used them as inspiration, in my artwork for decades and in my opera as well. Reclusive, inward, fervent. Dickinson's poems have emerged ever active in today's times. I mean, she has her own TV series, and she, of course, is a movie star, which is really great for poetry, so I'm all for it. However, in her own life, she led a quiet, introverted life in Amherst, Massachusetts, where she hid away in her pockets passages filled with wonder and visionary strangeness, such as, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. Or, a personal favorite is, how ruthless are the gentle. Or, electrical the embryo, but we demand the flame. When did she write? I asked myself about 5 years ago. I had always thought of poetry as something like words that exist in a bubble in the air without being attached to the earth by arms or legs. But I started to wonder, when did Dickinson write? So she wrote most of her poems at the time of our still intense and divisive American Civil War. So I wanted to find out more about the wilderness of America's early times and voices, spoken and written, similar to the how and why Dickinson wrote about the impact of her times, and how this complex interaction of people and geography has made time into history. This has become fascinating for me and has actually become something of a mission. Next slide, please. So let me tell you now about Anne Hutchinson, who lived 200 years earlier. She was a rebel and a visionary leader who was condemned as such. Coming here from England in the 1600s, she had had a vision in which she saw all the world appearing before God, so as to me an immediate revelation. Her sense of faith was free and a private gift. But in 1638 in Boston, Massachusetts, Anne was brought to trial for heresy by the patriarchal Puritan leaders for teachings in her home of her belief in private faith. Her words taken down in court are among the first words by a woman in our history. John Winthrop, a founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was one of her accusers. John Winthrop's scornful words led the vindictiveness of other ministers. He said, "This American Jezebel." Okay, now just listen to this. This is so sexual with what he accused her with. So, this American Jezebel, seeing the fluentness of her tongue and her willingness to open herself and to divulge opinions and to sow her seed in us. She had rather been a husband than a wife and a preacher than a hearer. She and her husband and her 15 children were evicted from the colony. Next, please. 40 years later from Anne Hutchinson we're looking at my work about Mary Rowlandson. She was also one of our earliest women's voices, but in print in America. Living in the woodlands of Massachusetts, she was swallowed up by the much feared wilderness when she was abducted by the Narragansett tribe and lived with them for 11 weeks and became a slave of a Sagamore Indian Quinnipiac. She wrote and published a unique and nuanced captivity narrative. And in defense of the Indians, she wrote, "One of the Indians gave me a Bible from plunder, and not one offered the least miscarriage or unchastity to me." So let us note that women at that time were not really supposed to speak out loud on their own. If you were a woman and you wanted to voice an opinion, you were supposed to speak through a man, a brother, a husband, or a son, not through your own voice. However, her captivity narrative went on to be something of a bestseller. Next slide, please. This is my studio. And 100 years later, in 1787, Mother Ann Lee, who is in the image in yellow with the blazing tree on her front, Mother Ann Lee came from England and established the first Shaker meeting house in Mount Lebanon, New York, and founded the Shaker religion. She, like Anne Hutchinson, had a vision of personal grace, and core values of the Shakers evolved as simplicity, celibacy, integrity, and inclusion. There was gender equality, men and women seen as equal, and through another series of visions, she quietly affirmed that all animate life was both female and male. Therefore, God was manifest in both male and female forms. They were also pacifists and welcomed many African Americans, Native Americans, and orphans during the American Civil War and after. Her way of worship included, we're all going to want to join now, her way of worship included ecstatic wild dancing, loud singing, and shouting. As Dickinson wrote, "Take all away from me, take take all away from me, but leave me ecstasy. This free form of physical emotionalism attracted many seekers. Eventually, almost 5,000 believers lived in communal villages spread from Maine to Kentucky. Next, please. And to close, Sojourner Truth is, so these dress figures are 8 feet, and they are my homage to these women that I speak of tonight. So to close, Sojourner Truth is a heroine sewn inside America's stain of slavery, who escaped and shaped herself into a leader and a speaker before thousands for truth. Of her time as a slave, she said, "I used to hate white people," but she went on to be a free woman, fearless and forward, an abolitionist, an orator, a visionary woman at the very roots of the women's rights movement. On May 29th, 1851, she addressed the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. "Aren't I a woman?" she said. She spoke eloquently, and she's often misquoted as, "Ain't I a woman?" But please note, she was educated, she was from the North, and sometimes people like to make her sound more quaint than she really was. Another story of where this phrase, "Aren't I a woman?" came from is this, what I read. She was very tall, and she was speaking one day before a group of men and women. And they said, "You're not a woman. You are too tall to be a woman." And she said, they said, and your words are too strong to be a woman. You could not be a woman. And she said, "Aren't I a woman?" And she really, I read this. "Aren't I a woman?" And she lifted her blouse and she showed her breasts. And that's where that quote comes from. "Aren't I a woman?" As Dickinson wrote, "To be alive is power, existence in itself, without a further function, omnipotence enough." Thank you.
Wow, thank you, everyone, for what was a very powerful presentation by 4 very powerful women about very powerful women. So thank you, everyone. I think we have time for some questions. There's a question for Sabrina about how exactly you're putting your pieces together. If you could just sort of elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I sew them all together. So I take the strips of film, I put them like this, and I put them through a Bernina sewing machine. And then once I have enough together, it makes a fabric, and then I cut that fabric into a shape, and I use traditional quilt making equipment like rotary cutter, and there are these quilt squares and rectangles I use to like cut down the side of the film fabric. And then once I have enough pieces, then I sew the pieces together.
Right, fascinating. I love that process. Is this a question for Lesley? Could you speak about how your interest in these early American women began?
Well, my interest in early American women began with my readings of Emily Dickinson's poetry. But further back than that, I grew up in Maine and we summered in the Adirondacks. So I was very aware that the forests were dark and strange and full of divinity and deviltry. And, you know, my parents camped a lot. So I thought, you know, these early people that came over from England, they were camping here. I mean, of course, the Native American people owned the land, but who were the early American women? And especially, how did they speak out against the men who were just keeping and suppressing and keeping them down to keep order? I read that it was really, the patriarchs needed to keep a certain kind of social order because things were so scary at the time. You know, there were some early Americans that when they landed, they actually dug holes in the ground as caves. So who were the women that could write, that could talk? How did they start? I mean, how did we all start here? All of you out there in the video world. How did you start yourself, your life?
I have a question, or maybe a comment for all of you, please. It's prompted by Lesley's, the quotations that Lesley has used, but I'm really struck by, and yet she persists, that Elizabeth Warren on the Senate floor was being scolded for being too outspoken.
That's right. This American Jezebel again.
I was wondering if, no, please, would any of you care to comment on continuity and progress in your own life experience, perhaps, as artists or art historians? Is there something that you would be willing to speak about along those lines of independence and being, I don't know, keeping in your place?
It's Linda. I'll tell an anecdote that I will very much regret sharing, especially on Zoom. But nevertheless, this goes back to my first days as a graduate student at University. This is about my beginning of my graduate study at a very distinguished American university. And in my interview, I didn't realize really that I was being hazed, in essence. Everybody there who was in a position of importance was a man, a distinguished scholar. And I don't think they relished particular being assigned these, looking over the course cards of the incoming students. And everything that I said, you know, what are you interested in? And I said I was interested in this and that, but I knew that Columbia wanted me to not to focus too narrowly too soon. And he affected huge surprise. And he said, what are you talking about? We don't want people here who don't know what they're going to do. And this line of question and answer set up by, you know, and response went on for a while. And finally he drew back in his chair and he looked at me down his glasses and he said, I don't think we want you here at Columbia. I've now just given them away. And I said, but I've already been accepted. I mean, I was so stupid, you know, I was so stupid. And so he signed my card and he sent me on my way, but I staggered out, I remember. And I just wasn't going to let him see me cry. And so that was my introduction to graduate work. I look back on that. I marvel at my naivete. I wasn't very tough. I wasn't a New Yorker. But I give myself some credit for sticking to it. I think the last thing I said to him in a trembling voice was, I know I'm going to prove you wrong.
Good.
And I went on to get a doctorate, but anyway, so there you are.
Thank you.
That would not happen now, believe me.
Yeah. So there's progress.
This was in the 1960s. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right. I saw that there was one question about what does this have to do with suffrage? And Miranda and I organized the exhibition to promote women artists from our museum's collection. Many of the works of art hadn't been on view for ages, some probably never at all. Some of them were created by what we might consider amateurs from the 19th century. But the point was to demonstrate with this anniversary how women have tried to create a place for themselves collectively or individually as creative spirits when they were not even seen as full citizens. And then afterwards, what was the connection to the concerns that had prompted this artistic expression in the 19th century that remain relevant today? So perhaps the connection to suffrage is tenuous, but I was really interested in the relationship to full citizenship. And I should, of course, point out, meaning white women of a socioeconomic class from 1920. From before and after that marker, what had happened prior to, what had happened afterwards, and what remained constant?
Well, I think it has everything to do with suffrage, because I equate suffrage with emancipation and freedom. And all of the women who have been discussed today had transformative experiences in which it was simply necessary for them to make their way in the world. And I mean, I think that I was struck reading again the early story of Fidelia Bridges, living comfortably as a ship captain's daughter in Salem. And then everything was turned upside down when their parents died within days of one another, and they were on their own. And so the genteel skills that she was taught as a young lady of a certain socioeconomic stature were immediately put into a different position now. This was a way that she had to earn her bread and to help to support her several siblings. And so it's making a freedom for yourself. So I see them in a way as, you know, suffrage was a campaign for the political, the political recognition of those kind of acts, that women had an autonomy and an authority and a capacity that was not recognized outside of the home and certain kinds of accomplishments. So I think it really has everything to do with suffrage.
Thank you.
And there's something that's also about the emancipation and the suffrage of awareness. I was lucky enough as a young artist puppy here in New York City that my main mentor was the artist Nancy Sparrow. And I had not realized that I had always thought of the word hero as a man. So linguistically, she woke me up. All of her work always was about centered in a woman hero or heroine. And that changed me, because that was at a time when, a man, the word man or the pronoun he stood for all of us. And so I had just taken that for granted. You would read something and it would be like, and he did da, and it would supposedly include all of it. He went to the gynecologists, whatever. But I just want to give homage to her and thank her for her adamant support of women and speaking up for women as heroines.
I don't know if you all remember the first slide that I showed, which was the introduction to the exhibition. And I think on one side we see Sabrina's piece, and then there's one by Shayla, and there is the Kay walking stick piece. But what you don't see on the parallel wall is Nancy Sparrow work on paper, and it's a Maenad, a Greek goddess. And that section we called She Rose.
Yeah,
Like that.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. This is a question from Dee for Lesley. Dee would like to know if you can talk about your process and the materials that you use.
So thank you for asking about my process and materials. I use everything. My entire process is based on language. So if there are words that wake me up, which is how I came to art. I came to art late, in my 30s. And I came to find my voice as an artist through reading. And I still find my voice through reading. And it is when a phrase like from Dickinson, I like a look of agony because I know it's true, or the thrill came slowly like a boon. It's these words that come into my mind and go into my body, and they make me make the work in textiles, in metal, in performance. I did an opera. So it's the word, it's the core, I speak about faith along with, so for me, it's this belief in the truth of the word because I experienced that. I experienced the truth of the word in my body and in my work. So thank you for asking.
Thank you so much. At this point, on behalf of the National Arts Club, I would like to thank Sabrina, Linda, Lesley, and Mary for what was truly a wonderful, powerful program. Like I said, about women, by women. And thank you for the Munson-Williams Proctor Arts Institute for organizing this with us, being a fantastic partner. Thank you for everybody who joined us today, and I hope we see everybody soon. Thank you, everyone. Please be well.